much do we need to degrow to save the planet, which is moderated by our colleague Moritz Odersky, who is an economist at the World Inequality Lab. Moritz is one of the coordinators of the Global Justice Project, and his research focuses on international inequality and climate change. So please give a warm welcome.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome also from my side to this very first panel debate of the conference. We're going to have around 45 minutes debate on here, and then half an hour to 45 minutes of Q&A, so prepare your questions. But first I want to take a few moments to introduce the topic and our great panelists. So we all know that we're in the middle of a climate crisis, as we are on track to exceed the 1.5 degree emission budget within few years. We are already seeing the consequences of anthropogenic climate change all around us, and yet we know the starkest consequences are surely still ahead of us. And at the same time, this is only one of several ecological crises we are currently facing. So there's no doubt that urgent need for climate action is appropriate. Still, after a period of increased climate interest around the Paris Agreement 2015 and the widespread protests between 2018 and 2020, we now see a backsliding of climate action around the world. Private markets and more governments are pulling back from previous net zero commitments. So there's a clear necessity for both a change in our economic system, as well as in the political strategy, and also maybe the academic messaging that we use. In light of this, we might ask the question, how much do we need to degrow to save the planet? But we also need to recognize that at the same time, poverty numbers around the world are again increasing. So there's an urgent need to increase income and living standards of many people around the world. I'm happy to discuss all these questions with a truly outstanding panel, which I will briefly introduce. I'm first honored to welcome Jason Hickel. He's a political economist and research professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He mostly works on global inequality, ecological economics, and post-growth futures, and is author of the book which fits the session, which is called Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the Planet. Please share a warm welcome. Secondly, I'm happy to welcome Nicholas Stern. He's IG Patel Professor of Economics and Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Chair of the Grantham Research Institute of Climate Change, as well as the Global School of Sustainability, both also based at LSE. As one of the leading economists on development and climate change, he is widely known for the landmark review on the economics of climate change, published in 2006, which among economists and beyond is widely known as the Stern Review. Now, 20 years later, he has recently published a book which is open access, called The Growth Story of the 21st Century, The Economics and Opportunities of Climate Action. Also, please a round of applause. And last but not least, I'm happy to welcome Tejal Kanitkar, who's Associate Professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. She's a mechanical engineer by training, but already since 2006, she's working in the fields of energy and climate studies. Bringing together her perspectives from engineering, the natural sciences, and the social sciences, she works on the intersection of energy development and climate policy, with a particular emphasis on equity and justice, which will be sure interesting for our today's debate. Thank you. So to kick us off, I would like to ask each of you for your own vision for the 21st century and how your own pathway to get us there would look like. Maybe, Jason, you want to start?
Thanks very much. It's really nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's an honor also to share the stage with Nick and Tejal. Good to see you both. So yeah, I've got some scattered thoughts, I guess, to share. Also some things that I've been reflecting on following the first session, which I really enjoyed. And congratulations, by the way, to the team for producing such an excellent report. What I want to briefly talk about here is capitalism, which is a term that I don't think has been mentioned yet, but I think it's important because we have to understand that we live in a particular kind of economic system, and it's that economic system which is producing the kind of perverse effects that we're seeing right now, right? So when we look around the world, what we can see is an extraordinary paradox where we have extremely high levels of aggregate production, right? massive production to the point of overshooting 7 planetary boundaries and driving dangerous climate breakdown. But at the same time, we have massive human deprivation, like really like on a staggering scale. Something like 40% of people in the world cannot afford a healthy diet, something as basic as healthy food, right? And up to 70% of people in the world can't access necessary healthcare. I mean, just staggering levels of deprivation on basic goods and services. So what could possibly explain this paradox of high production and mass deprivation is capitalism. It's the capitalist law of value, right? Under capitalism, production and investment are organized around producing what is most profitable to capital. That's the capitalist law of value. So we get massive production of things like SUVs and mansions and fast fashion and the military-industrial complex and industrial beef, et cetera, problem sectors that are identified by this report. But we also have chronic underproduction of obviously necessary things like affordable housing and agroecology and public transit, et cetera, because these things are less profitable to capital, or in some cases not profitable at all. So we just don't do them, right? So as long as we're in the situation where capital is determining the direction of investment and production, we don't get the investment in the sectors that we need, and we get overinvestment and overproduction in sectors that we just don't need as much of. So this problem is actually particularly urgent when it comes to the climate crisis. Because look, renewable energy is obviously cheaper and better than fossil fuels. This is just a fact, something we urgently need. And yet fossil fuels are around 3 times more profitable than renewables. So capital, as long as capital is in control of investment, continues to plow finance into fossil fuels and does insufficient investments in renewables because that's what benefits capital, right? And so whether it's the need to reorganize production around renewables and scale down fossil fuels, or scale up necessary forms of production and scale down unnecessary forms of production, all of this is going to require ultimately overcoming the capitalist law of value and aligning investment in production more directly with human needs and ecological objectives, right? And there's a word for this, which is socialism, like bringing production in line with democratically ratified objectives. So that's quite important. Now, the rich countries also, by the way, the economies in the imperial core, face a particular challenge, which is that they have extremely high levels of energy use and material use, vastly overshooting planetary boundaries. They're the ones that are driving ecological breakdown on a global scale. Now, when it comes to energy use, we know that the scale of the rich countries' energy use is so high that it prevents them from achieving sufficiently rapid decarbonization. The higher the energy use, the more difficult it is to decarbonize quickly. And so we know they need to reduce total energy use. Now, some of that can be achieved through efficiency improvements, and we need to invest in more of that. But it also requires actively scaling down damaging, intensive, and unnecessary forms of production, and also reducing the purchasing power of the very rich, right? So this is quite crucial. This is a unique feature of how the transition has to affect rich economies. And again, of course, as long as capital is in control of production, that's not going to happen because capital will never voluntarily scale down profitable forms of production, no matter how damaging and unnecessary they are. I'll just briefly conclude, I guess, by also just talking about the global south. I mean, I very, very strongly support the objective in this report of achieving convergence on a world scale. I mean, this is a basic moral principle that we have to uphold. It's a core political objective for anyone who considers himself to be anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and is necessary for ensuring a world of decent lives for all. But it's also important to understand that, convergence is not happening right now, and is not going to happen under the current economic system, right? Because capitalism is a world economy that is structured according to imperialist principles. There's a core and there's a periphery, and growth and consumption and profit accumulation in the core depends on a massive appropriation of resources and value and labor from the periphery. And this is the basic dynamic that drives global inequality. And so that has to be overcome. And I think it's fairly unreasonable for anyone in the global south to think that they should just wait around for folks in the global north, in the imperial core, to become benevolent enough to voluntarily abolish the imperial arrangement. I think that what this is going to require is a political struggle from the Global South to achieve economic sovereignty, to regain control over their productive capacities and reorganize them around human needs and national developments, right, including building up their sovereign industrial capacity, rather than around servicing consumption and capital accumulation in the core. And so that's going to require an anti-imperialist political struggle of some sort, and that's, I think, what we have to face up to.
Thank you. I would like to also hear the visions of our other two panelists. Nick, do you want to go? You can take the mic there.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be back at the Paris School amongst so many old friends. But if you forgive me, Moritz, I'd like to remember two friends who are not here. One is Tony Atkinson, who died nearly 10 years ago, who was a great friend of the school, very much involved in the supporting cast of the original founders, and indeed supervisor of Thomas Piketty, and close collaborator with François Bourguignon and my closest friend in economics. And also Roger Guénéry, the first president of the Paris School, who we lost a few months ago. Forgive me for starting with those, but they were wonderful people, and we were privileged to have known them, and very much of the Paris School of Economics, and of course pioneers in the study of inequality. So we've got just a few minutes at the beginning, so I want to make 4 points. First is that inaction or weak action is the most unequal thing we can do. The people who get hit earliest and hardest by climate change, the poor countries of the world and the poor people of the world in the richer countries of the world. So our interest in inequality must start with that observation, that we're in a hurry, and that that action is critical to tackling not only the climate but also the inequality. They come together. The second is to underline the urgency. Both you, Moritz, and Jason have already done that. I want to underline it even more. When we did the Stern Review 20 years ago, we thought that we might be adding about 0.2 degrees a decade. We were then 0.8. Had that been true, we'd be at 1.2 now, 2 decades later. We're pretty close to 1.5, yeah. We're already probably 1.45 on a trend basis. We'll be over 1.5 with El Nino, and then not far away, as you said, Moritz, at the beginning, from over 1.5 at a trend basis. Adding 0.3 for 2 decades, we're over 2 by mid-century. We are in a spectacular hurry. As we go to 2 or 2.5, we don't know how close we are to tipping points. Thawing the permafrost, collapse of the Amazon forest, the overturning of the AMOC, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, collapse of land-based ice, which of course kicks up the Archimedes principle, the collapse of land-based ice kicks up sea levels very quickly, much faster than thermal expansion. So the tipping points that we thought might be around or increasing in probability close to 4 degrees centigrade, it now looks that they have quite high probabilities between 2 and 2.5. So if we get to 2 degrees by mid-centuries, it's sadly quite likely that we are, then the risk of those tipping points with unmanageable dynamics, because they feed off each other, is very high. And every time you look at the science, it looks worse. So that urgency we have to keep at the front of our minds. And if you excuse me, one remark, Jason, if we first have to get rid of capitalism and then have to deal with climate change in that order, that's a lot of work in the next two decades. And there's a clear risk that if we put it that way, we'll do neither. The third point I wanted to raise, and here absolutely overlap with the report. The center of this story is investment. The center of this story is investment in the new. We won't succeed in running down the old unless we've invested in the new. The alternative and much more attractive paths of development available to the developing world, if they could only manage to move that investment forward, cannot happen. That, as it were, that kick-starting, that leapfrogging can happen only with strong investment. We can discuss just how much. I and my colleagues, Amar Bhattacharya, Veerasongwe and others, think we might do that with perhaps 3% increase in the share of investment in output. It might be higher. Certainly it will be higher in most emerging markets and developing economies than that. But one thing I think we have to keep at the center stage is that action involves investment, action involves systemic and structural and technological change. So our task, given the hurry, is to think through what sort of investment, how to create the conditions for the investment, and how to finance that investment. At the same time as systemic change, building cities where we can move and breathe, and land systems which are not degrading and destructive, and so on. That's the big challenge. That's what we have to keep at center stage. And that investment will bring us growth. It will bring greater efficiency, less waste, more productive structures. The clean is cheaper than the dirty across much of what we do. Efficiency is part of that investment story. Efficiency is productivity, is growth. So for the next, if we get that investment going, this is a growth story of the next 20 or 30 years as a consequence of doing what we have to do to tackle climate change. Of course, a growth story very different from the dirty, destructive models of the past. And no one, I hope, is talking about growth forever. I don't really quite understand what growth forever means, but anyway, that's not what we're talking about. So this is an enormously attractive story, and if we can show how that can be realized, then it seems to me that we increase the probability of it happening. But there's a lot of storytelling to do and a lot of investment to flourish. The last point, it's implicit in what Jason and I have already said, is that the biggest part of that investment is in emerging markets and developing countries. Just to take one way of expressing that, the infrastructure that India will have in mid-century, or if you like, 2047, the 100th anniversary of independence, more than half that infrastructure will be built between now and then. Now that statement of India, which of course is not the poorest of countries, is even stronger in terms of the proportion that will be built between now and then. If that infrastructure looks anything like past infrastructure, then say goodbye to 3 degrees. And of course, remember, 3 degrees would probably see billions of people on the move, and as a consequence, conflict, the reason for the conflict you couldn't turn off. So that story of investment is one that's focused in the developing world. It will need a change in direction of flow of capital, in the sense, for a long time, as Jason said, capital has been flowing uphill, if you like, from its most productive potential use to the lower productive potential use. And we should, I hope, in this discussion, talk through how that can be changed. I think it can be changed. I think it's a matter of getting the conditions for investment in the developing world right. That's a matter largely for the countries of the developing world, but there's lots of support. But also, and crucially, the financial structures where the cost of capital in much of Africa is at least 20 percentage points, and the clean is not cheaper than the dirty at that cost of capital. The clean is much cheaper than the dirty at the cost of capital at 6, 7, 8%. So there's a big challenge there in getting down that cost of capital. And the financial institutions, particularly the multilateral development banks, working with the private sector, I think have a major role to play there. I mean, lots more detail, but perhaps in the discussion.
Thank you. And maybe, Tejal, you can... Tejal, you can share your own vision.
Thank you. I think there is much commonality in this, in the way in which we envision the future. In the sense, none of us want to see a world which is, characterized by the same kind of strife and drudgery and hardship as it is today for most of its inhabitants in the future. I think, however, the devil is, of course, always in the details. The point I want to make about the past before I go to the future first is that one of the reasons why for developing countries, and this is true in the international negotiations in many forums that discuss climate change much more actively, is that the issue of climate change has always been about development. Unlike previous issues of environmental degradation or pollution, even thinking of this as externality has not ever been the way in which we've thought about climate change. It has been intrinsically tied to the question of development. And this is because of a problem that I think has not been solved by traditional economic approaches to the issue of climate change. That is, that do we have the means today to provide the kind of advances that have been possible over the last 100 years. And I disagree with the concept of destructive mode of the past 100 years. Of course, the major advance of the past has been the creation of conditions that have enabled, that have made possible emancipation from drudgery, from hardship, right, from human labor. The fact that those advances have been appropriated by a few, making the rational advance of productive capacity to emancipate everyone not possible, is of course a reality that we have to deal with. But the fact that these conditions have been created is something that we think is I think is a good thing of the past. But the fact is that today you have, we have all spoken about stark inequalities, but it's not simply an inequalities in terms of incomes, which hides a lot, I think, in terms of what it really means in material terms. France has an energy consumption of 37,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And this includes industry, et cetera, everything. You compare that to India. India is about, France is about 5 times more than India. India is at around 8,000. You compare that to Tanzania, France is 25 times more, which is at around, much lower than that. And France is 92 times more than the energy consumption in Chad. So what I also missed from the first session was, what are these physical quantities that we are talking about? Where are they? It's one thing to say incomes, but what about physical infrastructure? Right? I think Nick spoke about the fact that a lot of the infrastructure that we need for the future is yet to be built, and most of it is to be built in the global south. How much steel does that require? How much cement do we need? How much how do we build piped water systems? How do we build sanitation? Because these energy numbers are linked to those kinds of amenities. Health outcomes are not automatic. You need conditions to be created to achieve equitable health outcomes. Right? So, for example, France has 100% coverage of clean water, and this is basic. Right? This means that water is treated at the source. It is free of major contamination. It is available on the premises, and it is available when needed. In India, this coverage is around 50 to 60%. In Tanzania, it is about 20 to 30%. And it's dismally low at around 5 to 10% in Chad. Okay? Sanitation, about 50% of the world does not have access to clean sanitation. How are we going to build these systems in the future? I think is something that is really important. And of course, all of us agree that gender equality is something that we must have as a part of our vision for the future. But it doesn't simply get created through investments in renewable energy. You need to create conditions for the emancipation of women from pre-modern social relations that reproduce their unfreedom. And these don't simply get created by solar panels and windmills. Right? You need mobility. You need, you need labor force participation. You need conditions of work to make that happen. And this has been the central issue in the demand for a fair share of the carbon budget from the developing countries. They were the first to articulate this demand many, many years ago. And this is not simply a right, asking for a right to emit. It's not even just an accounting mechanism. You can't substitute what is actually needed in physical infrastructure terms simply by climate finance, simply by saying that there will be money available, but you make sure that this money is, spent in, building solar panels, for example. Right? How is it that, do we know today, for example, that renewable energy, and there have been fantastic improvements in technology, no doubt. I'd be last to deny it. But can renewable energy do in the next 30 years, or electrification purely, do in the next 30 years what fossil fuels did over the last 100 years? The answer is we don't have the empirical or the technological basis today to say that, yes, it can do it. Right? And this is why the share of the carbon space, it's not a conversation only about investments. It's not a conversation only about transfer of funds. What do I do with money if I can't use it to actually build infrastructure? Unless I can use, if it's money available in cash, I can burn it and cook my food on it. But that's not the point. I need to be able to build infrastructure to be able to survive the impacts of climate change. And I agree that we are going to face impacts, and the poor are going to face bigger impacts. But I think one of the things that is less popularized about the IPCC, a lot of the things that shouldn't, in my opinion, be so popular are popular. But what the IPCC report, the most recent one, actually said was that the impacts of climate change in the near term, near and medium term, are far more determined by levels of vulnerability, which is directly linked to the level of development, than they are to warming levels. So does a world which is, let's say, 2 degrees Celsius warmer, but far more equal, with far more better levels of well-being, with far lesser vulnerability, even though it means that we are dealing with perhaps some unknowns in terms of climatic impacts. Are we more prepared in that kind of a world to deal with those impacts? I would say yes. Rather than a world which is unequal, which is where a large capitalism can find a solution to climate change. But it will most likely be a solution that will be on the backs of the poor of the world. So if you don't want that, then we have to think of climate change as essentially a problem of development. And I also want to congratulate the team of the Global Justice Project, because I think the solution space, the discussion today is based on a very narrow set of proposals. Right? Either you have the integrated assessment models kind of scenarios for the future where demand is constrained. And the bogey of degrowth has always faced developing countries in the climate discussion. Either our consumption, energy and incomes are constrained, or you have the the limits to growth kind of Malthusian arguments coming from the global north. So you have a range of things that have faced the global south, but I think the broadening of a discussion, more proposals on the table, definitely is necessary as we think about the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these great opening statements. I think we can see that there's a lot of commonality here. We clearly need a different path forward and a lot of structural change as well as investment. But maybe in all of these different versions, one might actually question this timeline and thereby maybe the realism. So in the one hand, if we work together with private capital, that's not what we are seeing is happening right now. So actually many of the private firms and investment funds are pulling out of climate change. So is there really a path forward where policies that keep the overall economic system close to what it is can stir this investment to not only climate change but also development? And on the other hand, Nick has already hinted at this, if we want to go and we say we go beyond capitalism, how can this look like? How can we start there? What kind of policies can we take? Is there still space for private investment? Is it enough to decommodify some basic services, health and education? But what if the rest? There's still much more to our economy, which we also need. So I wondered on your opinions of both this, kind of looking more at the concrete steps that we can take now to get to these visions, because I think there maybe, as you said, the detail is in the devil, the differences lie, and I would like to explore them more, and maybe we find more commonalities. Tejal, you want to start or? Yeah.
I think in terms of the more immediate steps, this is what I ended with. I think if you begin the conversation with decarbonization, you've lost half the world. How do you decarbonize when you haven't even begun carbonizing? Right? It's not even something that Africa can join in the conversation. And so the key question for large parts of the global south is really the impacts of climate change. And how is it that, do we have the means to be able to protect people from the impacts of climate change? And this is where the conversation must really begin in the question. Of course, there's a political requirement in the more immediate sense to talk about urgency and the climate crisis in the global north. But we don't face the same kind of denialism, and it's really quite funny that climate change denial is quite significantly an aspect of the global north, really, not so much in the global south. And perhaps rethinking some of the messaging around climate change, about how is it that we speak about climate change in the global north is definitely necessary. And beginning from what is it that is needed in the more immediate sense to reduce vulnerability of the people who are facing impacts today. We're not even talking about 2050 or 2100, but we're talking about the impacts of today. What is it that is needed I think, should be at the center of the table. We start the discussion there. And of course, there is no country today other than the US who denies that that they have to contribute to climate change mitigation. India's arguments, China's arguments are not what they were 25 years ago. So even irrespective of which government is in, you have from the left to the right, you don't have too much difference in the climate discourse in many of the countries in the global south. So in that sense, I think if that is climate change adaptation, reduction of vulnerability, and dealing with impacts, if that is what we begin with, then the conversation, I think, is far more inclusive of many of our concerns.
And just a small follow-up, do you think the steps to protect people from this vulnerability are there? Are they, or do we need to find them still?
No, I think, in fact, those are the things that we know for sure are there. It's on the other side. It's on the energy supply side, where Anmol ended with saying that technology is available. We just need the political will to do it. And there, I think, for some things we don't have the technology. For example, we can build buildings. We can build a building that can be completely powered by renewable energy. But to build that building itself, you need something more than simply only renewable energy. But do you have the technology for early warning systems? Of course we do. Do we have technology that can protect people from sea level rise to a certain extent? Of course we do. Historically, this has been done in low-lying areas, right? But the problem is when you conflate the issue of decarbonization with this, today, you have, from the IPCC to the UNFCCC, people from the global south are being told that if you pursue the same kind of technological solutions to protect your people even, and they lead to increase in carbon emissions, then you are eventually, negating your own interventions. So you're forced to align all your expenditure, all the way in which you think about economic policy towards decarbonization, where really a lot of, for a large part of the global south, if not entirely, the questions are very different and not really focused on decarbonization at all.
Thank you. Do you want to respond, Nick?
Yes, thank you. Let's be clear, at least I hope we can be clear, that we share the idea that climate action on biodiversity and development are intimately integrated in the basic logic and in what they require of public policy. There is no horse race or spitting contest between climate on the one hand and development on the other, between climate action on the one hand and development on the other. If we let the argument turn into that, then climate action will lose and ultimately development will lose. But they are absolutely intertwined. In my book, which you kindly mentioned, Moritz at the beginning. Let me underline again, because it's LSE Press, it's open access. Download it for free. That integration is at the core, and I think it's at the core of everything that all four of us on the panel have said. So what we need to do is to talk about how we as a world, rich and poor countries working together, can drive that new form of development forward. That's our challenge, and investment will be at the core. Similarly, I think it's a mistake to set adaptation and resilience on the one hand against mitigation and emissions reductions on the other. We obviously have to do both at the same time, and a tremendous amount of what we do will involve all three of resilience and development and mitigation. Obviously, development itself makes you more resilient. I mean, better off people have more options and are more resilient. Investment in resilient and adaptation has very high returns. I mean, every time you look at it, you get sort of benefit cost ratios of 10 to 1. And let's be clear, if you have an investment project which has got very high returns, funded at a reasonable cost of capital, that is growth. I mean, you are better off as a result of that. Growth in the broad sense of development and growth. So in the logic, they're intertwined. In the practicalities, they're intertwined. I mean, think of mangroves. Mangroves happen to be very good at capturing carbon, and they are very good at breaking storm surges. And they bring you better fishing and shrimps and so on, and they're good for activity. And if you like tigers, then and tigers bring a bit of tourism, then they're good for that as well. I mean, there are many more. Restoring degraded land, mitigation, adaptation, development. Reforestation is usually mitigation, adaptation, development. Public transport, hugely important. Mitigation, adaptation, and development. If you ask me, what are your first priorities for this kind of investment? I would, put public transport alongside renewable energy. Decentralized solar is, in many cases, takes you independent of the grid. I mean, look at the way Pakistan had a fantastically unreliable electricity system. And of course, it's poor people who get hit worse by that. Suddenly, all those shacks and houses and everything are covered in solar panels. And they are more resilient then to disruptions in supply caused by whatever, including weather. So much of what we do is mitigation, adaptation, development, or wrapped up together, and our investment should be investment programs should be very clear on that. And let's also be crystal clear that the big majority of that investment will be in the private sector. I mean, if you look at India, the big majority of investment is the private sector. And there's the splendid Jean-Dres is here. He and I have been working in one village in UP, in Moradabad district, for more than 50 years now. And that village has changed. It's a poor village in a poor state in a not-so-rich country. And how has people's incomes gone up? Not very fast, but they have. Mostly it's investments they've made themselves in their own irrigation, in their own ability to, to look after engines of some kind, little bits of education that allow them a bit more mobility. Most of the investment will be private sector investment. So the challenge is getting the right public investments that can help mobilize that private investment and getting the right conditions for that investment. I probably shouldn't take the time now, but I would like to spend a little bit on the concepts of sustainability and justice, which I think are critical to all this. But I guess
we can
later.
maybe dive in the next question in that. Before, I would maybe love to hear Jason's answer still to this question, and especially also what your concrete steps are if you talk about moving from capitalism to socialism, often big words, and like what kind of concrete steps could we take there that are maybe practical in the near future?
Thank you. Yeah, so this idea that, look, if we have to first replace capitalism, then we're going to fail on climate. I'm not sure I really buy this actually, because my view is that the capitalist law of value, the system we currently have, is limiting us very, very severely from achieving very urgent objectives, right? Like you're right, Nick, about the urgency of this, and we're just so far off from achieving what we need to do. We're limited by the logic of capital, and it's crucial to understand, right? Capitalism is a fundamentally undemocratic system. Like even when we live in political democracies, like we do here, even if we acknowledge they're corrupt and inadequate for whatever reason, when it comes to the economic system, there's no democracy at all, right? No, like not even a pretense of democracy. Production and investment are controlled by capital, the richest 1% who own the majority of investable assets, and the large investment firms and the big corporations. They're the ones that determine what gets produced. And we have no say in that. And that's why we end up with the perverse outcomes we have right now. This has to be overcome. So the question is, what does it look like to actually overcome the capitalist law of value and democratize the economy, which is the goal here, right? It's actually not nearly as scary as, as it may seem. There's a range of policies that can enable us, a range of strategies that can enable us to do this. One very obvious thing would be industrial policy, right? Like standard industrial policy, which was widely used in the middle of the 20th century, but now we can't even talk about because we've all been brainwashed by neoliberalism, right? Like a key piece of industrial policy is, of course, credit guidance, where you impose rules on the commercial banks and say, you can't invest anymore in fossil fuels, you've got to redirect investments toward renewables. Basic stuff, right? That actually aligns investment with democratically ratified objectives. We also need a public finance system that can enable us to make investments in things that just aren't profitable at all, right? So these things, basic industrial policy, credit guidance, public finance, these are things that are already in use by one country quite extensively right now, which is China. And it's so funny to me the way that the Western ruling class is looking at China and be like, how do they manage to achieve this rapid development in the EV sector and renewable energy and battery technology, et cetera, and high-speed rail? These are not profitable sectors, so our capitalist class doesn't invest in them. How is China doing it? It doesn't make any sense. It's because China has public finance, like literally public control over the finance system, a strong credit guidance system, and industrial policy. They can guide investment and production toward alignment with their national development objectives. This is extremely powerful. These are the things you can do when you have control over your productive capacity, right? And so now we have the Western ruling class saying, no, we're going to do industrial policy, but we're going to do it differently. We're going to basically use a bunch of public funds to prop up the profits of our private firms and hope they're going to make the right investments. No, this is not a good idea. This creates inequality. This gives more power to capital. Wrong. I think there's things we can learn about success. I mean, like China's high-speed rail system, amazing example. In the Western press, every few months, you get these amazing stories that are like, China's investments in high-speed rail are going to be a big bust because it's not a profitable sector. They're expanding this network, but it's not profitable. It's all going to collapse, and China's going to have an economic crisis. But it never happens, right? Because China doesn't have the same kind of vulnerabilities to capital that we do. And so China can make investments in a massive high-speed rail public transit system without worrying about the question of profitability. If you speak to a banker in China's big investment banks, they will tell you to your face that profitability is not even in the top 3 of their main considerations when it comes to directing large investments. Not even in the top 3. This is staggering. We can't even conceptualize this. This is overcoming the capitalist law of value. Now, this is not to say that China does not have its own problems. Maybe we want to see transformations in China's economy as well. I mean, certainly I do. But these are examples, right, of what can be achieved. In terms of sovereign development in the global south, look, here too, I mean, industrial policy is necessary. It's important to understand, as long as capital controls production and investment in the global south, what they do is they invest in exploiting cheap labor in subordinate positions in global commodity chains, sweatshops, mines, blah, blah, controlled by Western firms, right? Because that is most profitable for them to do. Profitable for foreign capital and profitable for national capital. If we want development, we have to overcome that logic and make investments in industrial upgrading and sovereign industrial capacity, right? That requires industrial policy. Professor Comrade Ha-Jun Chang has made a career of pointing this out. We should listen to our friend. So I think also this is going to, by the way, I think crucially is going to require in the Global South, nationalization of key export sectors. Because right now you have the big export sectors are controlled by private firms, largely by Western capital in many cases. And so the foreign exchange they get from their exports, they don't even control. They can't even invest in development or industrial upgrading because it gets siphoned off in profit repatriation and through tax evasion, et cetera, et cetera. So Global South states need sovereign control over their export earnings so that they can make these investments in industrial upgrading and reduce their dependence on Western capital. This is crucial. The thing is that these moves, nationalization, industrial policy, basic development strategies in the Global South, are actually effectively against the rules of the World Bank and the IMF structural adjustment programs. Global South countries are prevented from using these obviously necessary strategies. So there has to be a break from that system. And a new logic of production and investment applied. And here I think this is why we actually do need South-South solidarity, South-South trade, South-South swap lines outside of the core currencies. We need move towards alternative payment systems that the Global South can implement to avoid being sanctioned, right, under SWIFT, et cetera, et cetera. Like these parallel institutions actually do have to be developed, and they're being developed right now, and we have to encourage that because again, like the reform that we want to see in the multilateral system is not currently occurring, and until that does occur, then I think these alternatives have to be promoted. Just a very, very brief final point. I fully support what Tejal is saying here, and I would also add to say this: like Global South countries that need to achieve decarbonization as well. Obviously, this also requires sovereignty. Ecological planning requires sovereignty. For them to transform their energy systems and their food systems and their transport systems, they have to have sovereign control over their productive capacities. And if they don't, this will not occur. And so sovereignty and sovereign development are the primary, like liberation is the primary objective for Global South countries before something like decarbonization can be achieved. Like the political must come first here because they're constrained, they're prevented from taking necessary steps under the current arrangement.
Thank you. We have around 10 minutes left before we open up the floor. And actually, as Nick suggested, I would like to talk about justice and what might that entail and the concepts of, for example, sufficiency. And also, Tejal has made this point of what reparations or justice beyond money or just financial transfers could look like. And I would love to discuss these concepts and your view on this. Nick, do you want to start? Or? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And at the risk of referring again to my own work, I gave the Tanner lectures on moral values in Stanford in March, and they're available on video, and they'll be published later this year. But just to say something about the terms sustainability and justice. Sustainability is a broadly shared definition, I think. It's to offer to the next generations opportunities at least as good as those that we had, assuming they behave in a similar way to those that follow. And so what are the options that the next generations have, shaped by, and basically endowments, physical, human, natural, and social capital. So when we talk about investment, it has to be investment across all those areas. Human is particularly health and education, natural capital is our land and our forests and our oceans, and social capital is in large measure about the institutions, the inequalities, how we relate to each other, and the various degrees of trust and mutual confidence associated with that. So that's the notion of sustainability. A more dynamic term is sustainable development. The air quality in Indian cities is nothing short of catastrophic, and that definition of sustainability would be satisfied if next year it was no worse than this year. And surely we have higher ambitions than that. So we're talking about sustainable development, I think, which is a much more dynamic term than sustainability, which is development, advance of living standards within sustainability as just defined. The notion of justice here, I think it's important to discuss carefully, because justice is often a sort of slightly teenage word. It's everything is unjust, and anything I dislike is unjust. and we have to be a bit more precise than that. And in this, I've learned most from Amartya Sen and his book, The Idea of Justice, which is essentially saying that a universal definition of justice is pretty hard, even though he lavishes a lot of praise of John Rawls for giving it a go. And he argues that what we can do in a more less controversial, more precise way is to identify injustice or injustices. And then injustice in that context is a right or entitlement denied. And then that shifts the discussion over to, well, what rights and entitlements do you have in mind? And then central to that, and it's a case I make strongly in the Tanner lectures, is the critical right here is the right to development. The right to, if you want to go to the Declaration of Independence, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in the same Article 2 of the Declaration, US Declaration of Independence, it refers to the role of the state as to secure those rights. Now, that is, it's consistent with what Isaiah Berlin spoke about with positive liberty, the right to act, and less strong is the negative liberty, the right not to be harmed. So those, it seems to me, are the right. I find the most fruitful way to pursue the idea of tackling injustice. Injustice is a shackling, a diminution of the right to development. That, by the way, tells us there's no right to emit. The development requires energy, but energy doesn't require emissions. And of course, emissions damage and kill other people. It's hard to see there's a right to do that. But the right to development is fundamental. It's in the Sustainable Development Goals. It's in the culture of many, many countries who would never have read, or might never have read, perhaps wish they had never read the Declaration of Independence. It's much broader than that, but that's just an example of how widespread. So that's the way I find it easiest to understand injustice. And in the Tanner lectures, I put consequentialism and the right, the standard cost-benefit approach to policy, which most economists share, at least in part. I think the idea of the right to development alongside that, I think, is extremely important. So I think if you put those perspectives together, the consequences and the right to development, and of course the perspectives of the great religions, you do get, as it were, a moral alignment around strong and urgent climate action. And in that context, given that this is a story of growth, through the new kind of investments, through building the different infrastructures that we've all of us on the panel been discussing, then the challenge, it seems to me, of action and the moral responsibility of the rich countries is to work to help and support the developing world as it chooses a different pattern of growth. So its moral responsibility is not actually about compensation. It's about a moral duty to support the actions that others are taking to advance their own development in a different way. There is that moral responsibility. Of course, it so happens that it's in the self-interest, as Thomas pointed out earlier, of the rich countries so to do. So this is one of those occasions where the self-interest and the moral responsibility align. But it is about supporting a new kind of development. If we try to knock it into compensation or reparations, you absolutely kill the discussion. People start arguing about, well, what? No, me? Where did I come from? Well, where were my ancestors from? What did they do? Did they know? And you dissolve into a fight. Exactly at the point, what you're trying to do is to get people together to support a different kind of development.
Tejal, do you agree?
Well, I agree that what we are really talking about fundamentally is a right to development. There I agree. And there is, of course, a strong correlation of that to the right to energy. Where I disagree is, so let me begin with saying that I gave some examples, but in France, for example, there's one about 300 people for one hospital bed. Right? In India, it's about 1,500 people per hospital bed. In Chad and Tanzania, it's about, I'm using the same countries because I looked up the data just before this panel. It's about 10,000 people per hospital bed. So when you talk about healthcare for everybody, equitable healthcare for everybody, the massive number of hospitals themselves that you need to actually build across large parts of the global south, not to mention all of the other attendant requirements, medical personnel, the availability of vaccines, the availability of medicines, et cetera, all of that together. Is that possible, okay, today? Of course, it's possible to do, and we have the resources to be able to do it. We've done it in one part of the world. There's no reason why it can't be done in another part of the world. It cannot simply be done by transferring money. And so the climate argument, while part of it is climate finance, that there has to be support from developed countries to developing countries to be able to undertake low carbon development. There is no way that we will be able to do what, and there is no reason why we should either, what the developed countries did over the last 100 years. There are, of course, different ways of doing it, and public transport is an easy, sort of one of the easiest examples of this, that should be the focus of the future, right? But there is something that you simply cannot get away from, is a significant increase in material requirements that you have to provide for, right? And that today is not possible simply by saying that I will give you finance, put up solar and windmills, panels on top of, on rooftops or in the sea or wherever it is that you can find land, put up these systems, and you will be able to get the kind of health outcomes or the kind of educational outcomes that are equivalent to Norway or Sweden or, or other parts of Europe. So you need also the physical carbon budget, simply because concentrated, and this is, I am a bit of an outlier in this group, I'm not an economist, right? So there's a certain kind of productive activity that is made possible due to concentrated forms of firm energy that coal, oil, gas provide, that electricity and renewables simply do not today. And you need to account for that. Does that mean that you have to do the things in exactly the same way that Europe did 100 years ago? Of course not. But the fact that you still do need to provide what we are trying to deliver is not, poverty eradication, sustainable development are operative terms, but really the delivery of modernity to large parts of the world requires that we actually do also have a right to emit. That is where I would disagree. And that's, right to emit makes it sound as if you're asking for the right to pollute. But like I said right at the beginning, climate change is unlike any other pollution problem of an earlier era. Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant in that sense, right? It is at the global level, of course, there is an issue. And so therefore, what you're asking for is a right to the global commons. A right to the fair share of the global commons, which is very different. Which is also very different from what developed countries have done, is used far more than their fair share. When you ask for a fair share, you're in fact asking, you're saying that you will do things differently as compared to countries. But what I wanted to just say, and to answer to answer your question, was that it is not simply money. It has to be more than money. And that need of building infrastructure has to be recognized.
Thank you. Jason, do you also want to comment on this?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I also want to say something about fair shares. But first, I briefly just want to say something about degrowth. Because, I'm just condemned to do this, right? This is my life, is trying to clarify, in fact, misconceptions about degrowth. So let me just try this really, really quickly. It's crucial to understand, and this is very clear in all of the published literature about degrowth. Degrowth does not target global south countries. It targets the imperial core. Degrowth targets the imperial core. It is the imperial core that is responsible for the vast majority of excess emissions in the atmosphere and excess material use in the world economy, including through massive appropriation of resources from the global south, right? So degrowth is situated within a world system analysis that targets the imperial core. The second thing is that degrowth does not call for all sectors of the economy to decline. This is very, very clear. In the earliest writings, you'll see this made clear. Degrowth wants to reduce damaging and unnecessary sectors that exist primarily only to service the interests of capital accumulation, right? And it wants to increase sectors that provision for human needs more efficiently, okay? So I think that we have to understand the anti-colonial dimensions of degrowth and also the sectoral transformation dimensions of degrowth. These are very important. And again, very well established in the literature. And so I do have a small objection to, and I've already discussed this with my colleagues, and so it's not new to them. I have a small objection to the use of the uniform degrowth scenario that's in the report, because that basically associates degrowth with just no sectoral transformation, just basically recession, just stagnation and recession, which is, it's funny because over and over again in the literature, degrowth researchers who are in industrial ecology and ecological economics and environmental economics point out that there's a distinction between degrowth and recession. And so this is not an accurate use of the term. I do strongly, however, agree with the report's use of the term convergence and sufficiency. I think this is amazing framing. This implements, in fact, what degrowth calls for when it comes to the global north, right? Like reduce the harmful and unnecessary sectors and increase the socially beneficial sectors, and therefore reduce aggregate energy and material use and achieve our decarbonization goals. Now, this brings me to the question of fair shares. I strongly agree with Tejal's point here. We have to understand the remaining carbon budget in terms of equal per capita fair share allowances, okay? According to what remains of the carbon budget for any given temperature boundary. This is the only just and fair way to think about this situation. And according to this approach, it becomes very clear that the rich countries have to achieve much faster decarbonization than anyone is presently planning to do. And it's really here where degrowth becomes necessary for the rich countries. Because if you want to achieve sufficiently rapid decarbonization to stay within fair shares of remaining carbon budgets, this is going to require rapid reductions in energy use in the global north. Faster than what can be achieved with efficiency improvements alone. That's it. That's really as basic as that. This is implemented in climate mitigation scenarios in the form of demand-side mitigation or sufficiency-oriented policy. It's already there. If you want to achieve sufficiently rapid decarbonization, this is just what has to occur. And this is, by the way, also represented in the report. The only thing is that I think that in the report it looks like the rich countries, I'd have to take a closer look, end up exceeding their fair shares. And so if you were to impose fair share requirements on the rich countries in this scenario, then I think you'd probably have to have them reduce unnecessary production to a greater extent. So that's it. So basically, like the imperative for degrowth in the imperial core actually emerges precisely from a justice principle, which is that if we're going to take fair share seriously, which, by the way, in the global south, they routinely call us to do, right? Like we cannot violate these demands. Already they're violated, sadly, and they're going to be continually violated. And the more rich countries violate them, the more they impose costs on the global south, not only in terms of damages and human life loss, but also it forces them to decarbonize faster than they otherwise would be required to do if rich countries upheld their own fair share principles. So I think that we have to package these things together, right? A justice approach, a fair share approach, and a hard look at what's required in the rich countries in order to enable this. But I will again, and I'll just conclude by saying, look, I agree. Like degrowth is very widely misunderstood in public discourse. I think it's a very useful analytical and scientific term. It has to be kept for that reason, but I don't think that like public-facing document needs to be using degrowth to signal their main scenario, right? But I think we at least have to be fair to the scholarship that we build on. That's it.
Thank you. Yes, this brings us to the end of the first part of this discussion, because I would like to have used the remaining half an hour to open the floor. And again, we would ask people who want to ask questions to stand up if they can and introduce themselves briefly, and also indicate who the question is for. And we will again take around 3 questions and then answer them as a pack. So
Hello.
First on the left, yeah.
Hi, my name is Pablo Astorga, coming from IPEI in Barcelona. Thank you very much for the previous session, for the presentation of the report. Fantastic effort. Yeah? A lot of ideas for thinking about, yeah? And quantifying those scenarios are fantastic. Yeah? Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. When I saw this target of equality in income per capita over the world, yeah, and coming from Latin America, I said, wow, we never managed to get any nearer to the USA over 200 years of independence. Yeah? And then also thought, well, that income target means also productivity target. Yeah? Because we cannot reach that income without labor productivity target. And the main problem, as you may know, in Latin America is productivity. And it's been always the main problem in terms of failing to catch up with the US. And not only labor productivity, but more importantly, total factor productivity. And then institution policies, okay? So if we want to sort of reach that sort of levels, or even catching up, we need to sort out those problems, institutions and policies. I said that they came up in this session as well. And now I thought also of this assumption of an homogeneous sort of structural change, which is needed in order to achieve that target. And I thought, well, that very much sounds like a Eurocentric sort of idea of the structural change that is needed. And I thought, would that be possible to have a structural change of that sort in Latin America? Well, ideally, fantastic, but can we do that? What is the current situation? Reprimarization. So it's away from manufacturing. That was a way of increasing productivity into services, but not the good services, personal services, okay, informality. That's a reality. How can we change those trends so quickly in order to reach that target in 20 to 30 years on? Yeah? So the sort of realities are very different, and I thought probably we will need to talk about decoupling in terms of the story behind the structural change of those targets, and give more flexibility to countries like Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the global South. They have to be different.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Let's try to keep the questions brief so we have many opportunities. There was a woman somewhere in the back who already got the microphone. Yeah, you stand up. Yeah.
Hello, so my name is Amalia, and first of all, I admire the three of you a lot. I have read your work, but I'm going to go in the same direction as the first question. So I feel that both the degrowth and the green growth scenarios that you have presented here, or that you present sometimes in your work, is not well adapted to some of the realities in the developing world. So I come also from Latin America, so maybe it's going to be repeating itself. But on the one hand, for example, when you talk about green investment happening in developing countries, you assume it to be a positive pattern. But for example, this is because we are talking about carbon emissions. But I think that green investment should not be only about carbon emissions, but about respecting also the planetary boundaries of the planet. So what is your opinion on that? And the second, I think that the degrowth scenario, in the way you presented it, is a way of democratizing the economy in the global south. But you give the example, for example, of China, which I would not consider to be an example of a democratic economy. And then you also talk about nationalizing without taking into consideration the institutions, which are objectively very corrupt, which do not consider in general the well-being of the societies they are entitled to consider. And so sometimes the public sector, when it touches a private sector, it makes it drown. So what are your opinions on that? Thank you.
I think those were two long questions. Maybe we can start with those two and then take another round in a minute. Maybe we can also try to answer briefly. Who wants to kick off?
Thank you. I think both those questions come back to what's involved with development, what's involved with making development happen, what's involved with supporting development decisions in the developing world. And I think probably all three of us, I've been working on economic development for 60 years in countries across the world, and I come at climate much later, but see it through the idea, through the the lens of what's involved in economic development and how can that be sustainable. And for sustainability, I emphasized earlier, it's investment in physical capital, natural capital, which is, of course, particularly health and education. Sorry, the human capital, health and education, natural capital, which is our land and our forests and our oceans, and social capital. So it's involved, development, sustainable development involves all of those things, and investment right across the board. So I think if you use, that's why I try to stay away from green growth and green. I mean, sometimes you do use those terms, but the problem is that it leads to sort of misunderstandings that slides back into a narrow version of what we mean by climate. And also, I think now I tried to say at the beginning, every time I say climate, please include biodiversity and the planetary boundaries. This is sustainability across the board. So we need a broad view of sustainability, and we need a broad view of development involving all those four capitals. And it is about increasing productivity in the broad sense of what that means, in the sense of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. So we have to think of this story as being about growth and development in that very broad sense, and investment in that very broad sense. An investment, just to pick up what Tejal was saying, will include a fair bit of concrete and a fair bit of steel. Now, we know how to make green steel, and it's a fair bit more expensive. We don't really know how to make green concrete, because the whole process of making cement in its chemistry leads you to emit carbon dioxide. And so what that tells us, of course, we have to be much more economical in our use of steel and cement, do much more recycling, be much less wasteful. But at the same time, we're going to have to do, and we have to face it in a very direct way, we're going to have to do quite a lot of carbon dioxide removal in this whole story of sustainability. You've got 1 billion plus cows in India. Those aren't going to disappear overnight, right? And they produce methane. So what are you going to do? I mean, if you want to go out and deal with India's cows, you're a braver person than I am. And why should you anyway? So, but there will be quite a lot of carbon dioxide removal. And that's something where if we get the pricing right, that could be a source of income, particularly for developing countries, but we're going to have to do that anyway. So we have to look right across the board at what we have to do, and we keep coming back. How are we going to, as a world, developing countries particularly, because that's where the big story lies, how are we going to get behind that investment? And let's be honest, the big majority of that investment is going to be in the private sector, including from very poor people.
Jason is eager to answer. Tejal, do you also want to answer? Or?
Touch on a couple of points.
Okay.
Briefly, but
Okay, Jason.
If you want. Okay, yeah, no, thanks for the comments. I'll be as quick as I can. First, I want to emphasize again that degrowth is targeted at the imperial core. It seeks to reduce resource use in the core so as to enable the global south to increase resource use, increase its use of the planet's resources. And so it's about this, it's about a fairness dynamic. To the question of China and economic democracy, look, I think we can see this in two ways. First of all, China has national development plans and industrial policy, which are actually determined, in fact, through China's NPC election process, right? Which is a national election process that begins at the grassroots with everyone participating in the elections, and then goes through a delegation process until you get to the people who are determining the national development plans. However, so it's in that sense, it actually does align production and development with democratically ratified objectives. However, it is also crucial to understand that most production that happens in China is in capitalist firms, where workers don't have a say in production, right? These are capitalist firms. Now, my understanding from speaking to people in the CPC is that this is actually something that they want to address in the coming decades, and there's moves now to develop committees for workers to actually have a role in management decisions within firms, and I believe they'll be rolling this out in the coming in the coming decades, let's hope, let's watch this space and see, but that could be a major transformation. And then finally about the question of nationalization and corruption. So you're worried about nationalization because this might actually enable state officials to be even more corrupt than before. Possibly, maybe, yes, but the crucial thing is that even within the global south, right, like transformations need to occur to unseat the current comprador capitalist class and bring production in the national economy more in line with democratic objectives. And so that corruption problem, to the extent that it exists, would be dealt with that way. I think it's also important to understand like why is there corruption in the global south? I think this is actually an effective capitalism because in the core, then the capitalist class can benefit from super profits, right, derived from the periphery. In the periphery, they don't have the ability to exploit another periphery in order to obtain super profits, and so the capitalist class is constrained to get its profits through corruption. Like this is actually an effective of pressures for capital accumulation that I think ultimately need to be overcome.
So I just wanted to touch on something that perhaps we've not discussed so far. And, I think Jason started off with, it didn't use the term degrowth at all. And I think that's necessary. I think otherwise you spend a lot of time explaining what degrowth is not, rather than calling for socialism or distributive justice as you really want to. So, one of the things that I wanted to discuss, which hasn't been discussed so far, is the concept of planetary boundaries. Now, this is in itself, I mean, it's simplified. It is very attractive. It's a very simple sort of way in which you can take science to the people, and we are all very uncomfortable with questions of uncertainty, right? So when you're told that there's a boundary, it's all, there's no probability associated with this or that. It's quite attractive. But there is a fundamental assumption here that the planet of some thousands of years ago, or maybe even 200, a pre-industrial planet, was somehow stable, right, and benign. And it is human interference that, in fact, destabilizes it. It's also, there's a view of the planet or nature as above human society. The fact that we transform nature through work is of course true, but then we transform ourselves as well in that entire process. So this understanding of static planetary boundaries is somehow a little difficult to reconcile. It also then sort of tends to go towards more romanticized, idealized versions of this imaginary past, which was benign, great for nature, but it was also full of oppression and exploitation of a large number of communities. It's not as if before the advent of capitalism there wasn't any exploitation. So, one has to be a little careful about how this is used. And I would disagree that somehow beyond 2 degrees Celsius, of course there will be more impacts. Of course there will be there are uncertainties. But will the world become uninhabitable beyond 2 degrees Celsius? I mean, that's debatable. 2 degrees Celsius was a negotiated target. It was negotiated precisely because there are a lot of other concerns, not just reducing emissions, but building, climate resilience, adapting to climate change, eradicating poverty, etc., all of which is in agreed documents across countries. So does the world become uninhabitable? Does it become more uncertain? Does it become more unpredictable? Yes. But this hard boundaries across many of those, and there are of course debates within the discipline itself about whether the nature of some of those boundaries are in fact planetary or not. Climate, of course, is planetary, undisputably. So that is something that I wanted to sort of just flag here, that perhaps it's a little, we need to be a little more, need to have a little more discussion about the use of the term planetary boundaries.
Thank you. So we take 3 more questions.
Hello, my name is Rachel. I'm a just finished my doctorate at Oxford, so I don't actually know what to call myself. My question is really to push back on, this idea of socialism. I think the point you just made, which is, if you think about development, you have to think, if you don't do that, what's the other thing? And with this idea of replacing capitalism with socialism and using China as the example, the Chinese Communist Party has decided that it's going to, the basis of its legitimacy is going to be fairly shared economic development. That's not the foundation of how many socialist governments stay in power. Russia uses industrial policy as well. It just targets all of that state money to oligarchs. And so I think, nationalism or nationalization of state resources in many parts of the world just channels resources, jobs, and profit to political allies. So I really think when we're thinking about solutions for countries and how to target inequality, it needs to be founded in the domestic realities of those countries. And China having like 3,000 years of bureaucratic exams and a communist party that really only in the last 2 decades has made economic development as the foundation of its legitimacy, I think is underscoring the risks of a lot of the things that you're saying, and it's encouraging us to replace a system that really replaced rural, I'm forgetting the word, but rural lifestyle for most people, which I think, again, we have this idealized idea about what rural life is. Rural life is really tough, mostly for women, but also for everyone. So I just wanted to push back against a little bit this idea that it's easy to replace capitalism with this and it will solve the problems. Thanks.
Over there. The person over there already has the microphone. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Laura Pereira, Wits University, South Africa. I think we're having the Africa question and answer session after the Latin American one, and the Stockholm Resilience Center. So I had some questions on justice, this idea of equating the right to development with the right to emit, which I think is something that we really need to unpack, because that's been the problems with the negotiations. And I think the right to energy security is a much more important thing actually to emphasize from a development perspective, because you can look at Nigeria, Angola, even home in South Africa, where the right to exploit fossil fuels has done absolutely nothing to meet the energy security needs of people, and the arguments that we can continue to build up this infrastructure without actually looking at the systemic and structural inequalities of why we're not actually seeing that energy translated is something that we really need to talk about. I was then going to actually ask the question, which is the looming one in the room, around the energy transition and the implications of that and creating green sacrifice zones in the global south in other parts. So we're talking about electric vehicles, we're talking about electrification, battery storage, etc. But the fundamental material inputs to those transitions are coming from lithium in Chile, coming from cobalt within the Congo, multiple examples that you can have there. And so you're reperpetuating, I think, and relying on the moral integrity of the imperial core, to quote a adjacent term, I think, is actually just perpetuating these inequalities. So I'd really like to hear the justice implications of those energy transitions and how they're actually playing on the Earth system boundaries. And this is where I need to put my Earth system ecology hat on and say that so when you're talking about 2 degrees, you're willing to sacrifice entire small island states' existence, right? You're actually looking at fundamentally untenable conditions in most parts of the global south. So yes, it will be habitable for the billionaires, for the rich, for those who are able to adapt, but fundamentally it's not going to be for exactly the people that we're looking at. But the problem is we're starting to look at carbon removal through planting of trees, through other things, which is actually impacting on the biosphere, on biodiversity in vast parts of the global south. So again, we're seeing this perpetuation that we're not actually breaking down in this conversation, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 7 minutes left, but I promised 3 questions. So one very brief question, please.
Hello. Hey, thank you so much for your contributions. My name's Oscar. I'm a master's student. I'll be super quick. It's basically my question's about institutions, and I want to tie it back to 2 things that have been brought up a bit. One is the point about climate denialism being on the rise in the global north and the place that has to degrow the fastest, and then also the point about speed, right? We really need to hurry in this transition, especially in decarbonizing the global north. And I want to ask a bit about what institutions have the capacity to lead that in a democratic way, specifically when the national arena is becoming increasingly climate denialist and democratically backsliding. And what we're seeing a lot in the global north is cities and these subnational institutions leading this effort to decarbonize and to actually be democratically accountable. So what role do you think in the global north can cities and the subnational play in leading this transition when the multilateral and national level has basically become static? Thank you.
Okay, one last round of answers, 1 to 2 minutes each. Jason, do you want to start? There was the first question about socialism.
I can do that, yeah. Yeah, thanks everyone. So I've got to point out two quick things here. First is that Russia is not a socialist economy. Russia is a massively capitalist economy as a result, by the way, of Western interventions that destroyed socialism in Russia through brutal sanctions and political pressure and threats of warfare, and transformed it into, like under the tutelage of the World Bank and the IMF, into the insane capitalist hellscape that it is today. So Russia's not a good example. About China, I'm simply saying, like they're implementing industrial policy in a way that we can learn from. This does not mean we have to accept everything about the Chinese political or economic system. We can obviously have debates about that. But in terms of their use of industrial policy, particularly for climate-related production, we simply have to pay attention. We simply have to. I will also add here that we have a very esteemed colleague in our presence, Jean Drèze, who was mentioned earlier, who published in the 1980s, I think, if I'm not mistaken, a very brilliant piece that I think is woefully undercited, where he basically assessed the performance of the socialist economies in the 20th century versus their capitalist counterparts. And what he found is that the socialist economies delivered dramatically better human development outcomes at any given level of GDP, and later we know it's true also for resource use and energy use, because they overcome the capitalist law of value and they can organize production more directly around human needs and well-being. So, I mean, if these are objectives we want to achieve, why don't we pay attention to some of the lessons we can learn? This does not mean that we need to replicate everything that was done in 20th century socialism. But this should be part of our skill set, part of our toolbox, part of our conceptual capacity. I'm going to leave the lithium question to I guess, probably you, Tejal. but I also just want to say, you put it absolutely perfectly. Let me just close on this. And this is actually, I should have made this point myself. But really, like, I don't see degrowth as the horizon or the movement. It's just not. It's not a coherent political movement. I don't think it's a good horizon in and of itself. I think we have to understand degrowth transformation in the core as part of a broader post-capitalist transformation and part of an anti-imperialist transformation in the world system, right? Like ultimately it is economic democracy that is the objective. This has to be achieved in order for us to have any hope of being able to scale down the auto sector or the industrial beef sector, right? Like you actually have to overcome the capitalist law of value to do those things. And so I think that the horizon here is post-capitalism and anti-imperialist transformation. And then degrowth would just be a part of what you're doing to build a better world, a better and fairer world. But that doesn't need to be the movement or the horizon. Thank you, Tejal.
Nick, do you have last thoughts that you want to share?
Thank you. One of the, I'm an economist by trade and inclination, but the longer I stayed in all this, the more it's clear to me that we have to take political philosophy, political science, and moral philosophy much more seriously. A, because they're at the heart of what we're talking about, but B, because they're at the heart of the practicalities. And what we're talking about here, in terms of public policy that tries to steer in developed and developing countries both, investment into much more productive, much more efficient, much less damaging ways. We're talking about a role of the state which is very different from the market fundamentalism of the 1980s and 1990s. But there's a difference between a much more active state and total public ownership or an economy which is run in a very controlled way. But that role of the state is fundamental to all this. And it works with public policies, it works with standards, it works with sense of direction, it works with taxes, it works with subsidies, it works with how finance actually functions. That's the kind of role of the state that we're talking about. But we can't get away from the fact that the big majority of investment will be in private hands, particularly actually amongst poorer people. They invest in their lives. Of course they do. So that, I think, is a fundamental story. Within the role of the state, we lost Jürgen Habermas some months ago. That part of the role of the state is public discussion, public interchange. Amartya Sen takes that back to Ashoka. It's not that Habermas didn't sort of dream it up just suddenly, as it were. But that it brings legitimacy in a way that A, is a value in its own terms, but also makes public policy having a much better chance to succeed. So that's in part an answer to your question about institutions. I think the legal institutions are going to be helpful. I didn't think that actually 20 years ago, but the more they really are kicking in, and the statement of the International Court of Justice, I think, was really quite valuable a bit over a year ago. So I think that's a big part of the story, and that's my response on the institutional front. But let's think about the role of the state in effective public policy. Secondly, on Africa, Africa probably has 50-60% of the solar and of the renewable, particularly solar potential in the world, and it probably gets 1 or 2% of the investment. So a big part of the challenge is for Africa, with some support, to create the conditions for investment in new energy, and of course in the infrastructure of the cities that are growing so quickly. So that we're going to see a reconstruction of economic geography. In a world where investment is channeled well, then it moves to places where energy is clean and cheap. And we're going to see that Manchester and Newcastle and Leeds in the UK in the Industrial Revolution had coal and iron ore, and they were heavy, and the humans moved there. Now we're going to talk about an economic geography which is much more focused on clean and cheap energy, and that points to the developing world. If that's combined with the endowment of the new the greater focus on different kinds of natural resources, then again, that's good for the developing world. But you need structures of investment and ownership that are going to work. And of course, you need mining and so on of those things, which respects the environment. Again, that's part of public policy. Lastly, on 2.5, 3 degrees, Tejal, if we go much beyond 2 degrees, we will get to 2 degrees probably in 2 decades' time. And if we don't, really start to move, that shifts towards 2.5 pretty quickly. Then you start to get those instabilities kicking in. 3 degrees centigrade, hundreds of millions, probably billions would have to move. I don't know, it probably would not be a planet that could support 10 billion people. Of course, it wouldn't be extinction for everybody, but it would be extinction for some. And the process of moving from 10 billion to 5 billion on the planet is going to be really pretty horrible, right? And the antithesis of development and the antithesis of inequality. So let's not relax about drifting too far beyond 2 degrees. Of course, boundaries they're not boundaries in the absolute sense, they're boundaries in the sense that the probability of horrible things happening goes up pretty fast as you go beyond them. Finally, a thank you. See, most of the time I'm on panels where people think I'm an idealist and probably extreme in the pursuit of ideals. You make me look fantastically reasonable to audiences other than here. And that's a real contribution, so I thank you for that.
Thank you. And before we all go to lunch, Tejal, please.
Yeah, I know we don't have much time, but I just wanted to say that, of course, there is no reason why green capital will suddenly behave differently as compared to fossil capital just because it is green. So there's no doubt that happens. But I think there is a tendency, just like scientists and engineers and my group of people tend to completely ignore social and economic realities in which their technologies are implemented and deployed. I think economists tend to ignore the logic of technological development itself. The fact that it has its own logic, it has its own constraints, and it has its own directions as well. So this, I think, is necessary you need to bridge this particular gap. And I don't think that, I'm not advocating for runaway climate change. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we should. What I'm saying is that irrespective of whether or not it is 1.7 or 1.8 or 2 or 2.1, I think the task before us to make the world safe for all, livable for all, where everybody is able to pursue well-being and happiness. It's not about and whether the difference is 1.8 to 2 in that entire equation doesn't make as much of a difference, I think. And we can debate this, of course, but that's my opinion.
So with that, thank you very much for this amazing panel. It was a true honor to be on here with you. And thank you very much to everyone.